The Olympics in Paris has led to high viewership. However, there is a huge issue surrounding it.
Protests against the Olympics have taken place in Paris ahead of the Games, condemning the displacement of thousands of migrants, unhoused people, and other vulnerable communities. In a months-long campaign by French authorities that activists have denounced as a social cleansing.
There are thousands of people who live in the streets, migrant people who live in the streets of Paris. So there are solutions for these people. The problem is political choice is to hide them, because we don't want migrant people from some social status. We don't want people who are in an irregular position, but this is just a political choice.
Just yesterday, another group of hundreds of mostly African migrants sleeping on the streets of Paris were rounded up by armed police, forced onto buses, driven out of Paris.
Buses arrived to take away the homeless after a 3-day standoff with municipal officials. The French capital is trying to clean up for the Olympics. One by one, the migrants grudgingly boarded the buses under the watchful eyes of the armed police. This woman from Burkina Faso tried to plead with the authorities. The French government, instead of thinking about those who are coming here, they should think about us. We have children who are French, who by birth are not from another country. They are from France. They should think of them first.
This displacement is very much a Paris problem. But it's important to remember that what you're also witnessing here is an Olympic problem. When I say that this is an Olympic problem, what I mean is it happens in city after city after city.
It is the story that politicians locally in Paris and all throughout France do not want you to know about.
Paris's iconic Eiffel Tower is serving as a backdrop to one of the most photogenic venues of the 2024 Olympics. The landmark looks down at the Eiffel Tower Stadium where beach volleyball is being played at these games.
And quite frankly, it's because the powers that be really badly want shots such as these, like the Eiffel Tower over the beach volleyball matches, showing off Paris's beauty. And don't get us wrong, these shots are impeccable, but it does not mask the reality in the streets and the harm that this competition is causing.
What would you say to the world watching these Olympic Games and to the thousands of people coming into Paris for the Games? What do you want them to know?
I want them to know that we're not against the Olympics. We share the same values of friendship, solidarity between the people, the sports values also. But we want to say that we want these games to be organized differently in the future, and we all have a social responsibility to make these games better for the ecology, for the social inheritance that they will leave behind, and we all have this responsibility as citizens.
What's going on is called social cleansing, where the host country moves the houseless to make the city look better and deceive viewers who will be watching on television. A prime example from friend of the show Dave Zirin is this display you see on your screens. Former encampments have turned into Lego blocks such as these to push out migrants who just needed a place to sleep. It would continue getting worse. In April, some 450 migrants were whisked away out of an old building in a southern suburb of Paris to be displaced to another part of the country. There were men, women, and children on those buses. The Seine Saint-Denis, home to some Olympic and Paralympic venues, as well as the Olympic Village, saw at least 3,000 people impacted by the games per USA Today and Reuters. Zirin would speak with the Dan Le Batard show and give us a glimpse of just how dire it is locally in Paris.
Explain to me where this ranks as someone who's astute about the politics around these games all the time. How does the armed personnel compared to other times? The Olympics are always heavily secured because people are worried about all sorts of political things that can happen. How does it compare to previous times you've been to the Olympics?
That's a great question. You see, one of the big tensions in the Olympic movement is, do we hold the games in authoritarian countries like, say, China, Saudi Arabia, or do we hold them in democracies like Los Angeles or Paris or Rio? And what we're seeing is that the amount of military hardware that goes into these Western democracies actually makes them more like the autocracies in China and Saudi Arabia. And that's an important point, because one of the arguments that the International Olympic Committee always makes for why cities should host the games is that we are going to take these autocratic countries and actually make them more democratic just because of the presence of the Olympics. That's like bringing the gift of democracy and brother and sisterhood to a country. But the reality, and I'm seeing this in Paris, is the opposite. Paris looks a lot more like Beijing than Beijing was looking like Paris.
Paul Alausi, a representative from the medical charity Doctors of the World, would go on to say, quote, "There are spaces in shelters near Paris, but clearly they want to move them away from the capital, especially before the Olympic Games." Roxanne Pichilou, who heads a nonprofit helping hundreds of youngsters, would tell USA Today, quote, "They're kicking everybody out of the squats no matter where they are, and even if they don't want to build something there for the Olympics," close quote. For the Games, this is nothing new. In the years leading up to LA hosting them in 1984, authorities cracked down, enforcing laws that made it a crime to be homeless, rather than finding permanent solutions to the crisis. The beautification campaign explicitly targeted the homeless. Residents in and around Skid Row were driven out of view as visitors flooded into LA. The Geneva-based Center on Housing Rights and Evictions noted when Seoul, South Korea hosted the Games in the year 1988, 720,000 people were forcibly displaced. According to the Center on Housing Rights and Evictions, the 1996 Atlanta Games, one where Muhammad Ali famously lit the torch, saw local politicians work with the authorities to pass ordinances, and they would remove 9,000 people. Beijing, China hosted the Games in 2008, and because of it, the cause and effect was that 1.5 million people were displaced in and around the city, according to human rights organizations conducting studies on the matter. And when Rio de Janeiro, Brazil hosted, more than 70,000 people were displaced to make way for the Games. In 2020, for Tokyo, Japan, much like in 1968, hundreds of households were relocated to make way for the Games. Public houses were demolished. Hundreds were pushed out, most of whom were elderly. And here's the thing. Activists in Los Angeles, California are already telling us the move to punish the less fortunate is already in full swing. From Echo Park Lake to the areas around SoFi Stadium to various other parts of the city. In Paris, human rights groups expect many more of the estimated 100,000 Parisians without steady housing to be exported as far from the Olympic venues as humanly possible. These are people from displaced communities who encounter significant mental health risks, which primarily arise from their prior experiences of false persecution, war, and having to leave their home countries. The prolonged migration process in European countries further exacerbates the risk of displaced communities experiencing mental health symptoms and disorders. Lastly, from the conversation, after more than 100 years of repeated harms, perhaps it's time to co-sign Olympism to the dustbin of history. We must speak bluntly and honestly about these mega sporting events, identify their limitations, and voice meaningful opposition regardless of which nation is hosting. If that means a world without the Olympics, so be it.
Is there an ethical way to host the Olympics?
The question of questions. There it is. There are people who write whole books about how to do this. There are a lot of different theories about how to do this without debt, displacement, and the hyper-militarization of public space. There are ideas about maybe it should be like the Super Bowl and there are only 4 locations for the Olympics and you rotate through them. That's one idea. But then there's another idea that just says it's not economically or environmentally sustainable. So maybe we need to think about, actually throwing this in the trash heap and saying, let's try to think about international sports competitions in an entirely different way. Instead of trying to reform what we have, let's try to do it differently so it doesn't feel like you're turning a city into an armed encampment.
And to be clear, Zyron touched on it. I have seen some information on this as well. There are some solutions that likely should be put in motion. But until we do some of those things and at least try a different way of going about this, the end result will continue to be this. Rights being violated, people being taken advantage of, all in the name of the Olympics.